Hello, everybody. My name's Councillor Liz Clements. I'm the chair of the Sustainability and Transport Overview and Scrutiny Committee. I'm delighted to welcome everybody to our session this afternoon, which is taking place as an informal meeting via Microsoft Teams. We decided to hold this meeting informally following the positive cases of COVID at last week's full council meeting, where we've all been identified as contacts. So for safety and precautionary reasons, following a majority vote of the committee, we've decided to hold this session as an informal session. The agenda's been published, and the main difference that this will make is that the findings that we receive on the tracking report for the tree policy, that will have to be formally approved at our next in-person meeting. But I think that'll be the main difference. And as you all know, at the moment, it's not possible for us to meet formally as via video conferencing. So anything that requires a decision has to be done in person. So that's just the reason for moving this meeting onto an online session. And thanks for all the colleagues for joining us, and thanks to all the officers who are going to be presenting today. Okay, to move on then. I think we have received two apologies. I think is it that we've had apologies from Councillor Mick Brown and Councillor Julie Johnson. Basima, could you just let me know if have there been any further apologies from councillors?
No, that's all received.
Excellent. Thanks very much. Can I just check? Can everyone hear me?
We can hear you.
Yes. Yeah, excellent. Yeah. So just a reminder of our.
I can hear. Thank you.
Yeah, so our etiquette for the Teams meetings, in case we've all forgotten, is keep your cameras off unless you're speaking, and also mute your microphone to avoid feedback. Please indicate in the chat or raise your hands if you'd like to speak, and I'll try and keep an eye on that, and so will Basima as our committee manager, and yes, so that you can come in and ask questions or make a contribution to the debate on the various items. Okay. Just the next standing item is declarations of interest. We have some standing declarations of interest, but are there any declarations of interest from members which relate to any items on the agenda today? Okay, I'll take that silence as a no. I think I've omitted to say that this meeting is being webcast on the council's website for live broadcast and for future use, and anyone, members of the public or journalists, can take pictures if they want, unless there are confidential items. We don't have any confidential items today. Okay, so moving on, we have the action notes for our last meeting, which was on the 7th of July, have been circulated with the agenda papers. Can I ask if any members of the committee have any matters of accuracy with those minutes? I can't see anyone raising any matters of accuracy. And are there any? So can we? Well. We can accept that they're an accurate record, but that'll have to be presumably formally confirmed at the next in-person meeting. Is that correct, Basima?
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah, okay. And are there any matters arising from those action notes that aren't covered in our agenda today, which members would like to raise? Again, I'll take the silence as an indication that that's a null response. So we'll move on then from the action notes. We've got the three items today: the tracking on our tree policy inquiry, the consultation on the West Midlands LTP, the green paper, and the e-scooters briefing. I know that Joanna's joined us already, and she's got another commitment coming up hard on this meeting, so she's asked to go first. So I'm happy to hand the floor over to you now, Joanna, to talk to us about the recent extension.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Joanna Moscolidou. I am a Transport Planning and Investment Manager at Birmingham City Council. At the last Cabinet meeting, an e-scooter. So first, I would like to say that I don't have a presentation for today because I the invitation came a bit late and I missed the deadline. But what I'm going to do is a short verbal introduction to the Cabinet report that went to Cabinet in September regarding the extension of the e-scooter trial in Birmingham. So a bit of background to the trial. The trial was introduced last September as part of the government's decision to allow e-scooter trials in the UK as part of the green recovery measures that were introduced as a response to COVID-19. So e-scooters were previously, all e-scooters were previously illegal in the UK. An e-scooter is a scooter that's powered electrically and someone doesn't need to use their feet to make it move. And at the moment, those that are part of approved trials by the Department for Transport are legal. And these are provided as part of fleets. So, for example, in the West Midlands, we have Voi. It's the operator that provides the scooters in this area. The ones that can be purchased from shops and from the internet remain illegal. So those that are not, for example, in Birmingham, those that are not the orange Voi ones are still illegal, and this remains a challenge for us because they are widely used. So in Birmingham and the West Midlands, we decided to go ahead with a trial. This was centrally procured by Transport for West Midlands. So we have the same operator in Birmingham and other areas of the West Midlands. The operator is Voi. They are a Swedish company. And last June, we took a report to Cabinet to start the trial. Essentially, this report is to expand the trial because although the initial trial by the Department for Transport was for 1 year, the department decided to extend it. At the moment, the extension is until March, but we expect it to be extended further, and therefore this Cabinet report that went to Cabinet this September seeks an extension of the trial to keep it in the city until next September, which is for another year. So I can give a bit of a background to the trial, a summary of the findings of the trial so far, or I can take questions about the report. I have prepared some notes on the developments of the trial, if that's something that I can do.
Thanks very much, Joanna. That's very helpful, and really it was actually quite for this meeting, because we've got some other presentations following. It's good that you haven't got a big slide deck, really. But I think it would be good to give members the headlines from the findings of the trial so far, and I think focusing on how Voi have responded to the feedback from the public and what safety enhancements they've made, and some of the gains that have been made in terms of mode shift. I think what's particularly of interest to the committee is that the extent to which scooters have enabled people to transfer from private car journeys. But yeah, please just give us the headlines.
Okay, so I'm going to start with some headline findings, and then I'm going to cover what Voi have done as a response to concerns raised by the public and by officers. So first, I would like to say that this trial has certainly been a very long learning experience. It has been very useful working in a trial environment because we can interact with Voi and steer them. And we have worked with them to make the trial better. So far, we're still learning, of course, but some of the headline findings from a survey that Transport for West Midlands ran, which also is aligned with surveys that Voi themselves have run, show that in terms of demographics, the e-scooters seem to be particularly appealing to male members of the public. About 76% of the people who responded to the survey were male, and also younger members of the public. About 58% were under 34. In terms of what kind of trips they replace, when people who filled in the survey were asked what would you have used instead of an e-scooter. About a third of them said that they would have used a car, but about a half said that they would have either walked or cycled. So these findings are, I think they need to be understood better. In terms of safety, because this is a question that comes up a lot, in Birmingham and the West Midlands, so far VOI have recorded 11 serious injuries, the most serious of which was a dislocated shoulder. None of them has required hospitalization, and 107 minor incidents. However, these numbers need to be used or interpreted in context. These are incidents that are reported to VOI only. These are not numbers confirmed by the police, like we have official records on other accidents, and that's because they are not officially recorded as such. So they need to be, it's hard to compare them to other modes. VOI have also given free passes to key workers during lockdowns and free rides to key workers, and outside lockdowns these rides are heavily discounted. So far they've given 64,000 free rides. So these are some of the headline statistics. In terms of actions, so we have, since the beginning of the trial, we have taken both proactive and reactive actions with VOI to make the trial safer and respond to issues raised by the public. In terms of proactive measures, before the trial was launched, we split, let's say, the city into slow zones and no parking zones or no ride zones. So an e-scooter, because it can recognize where it is, in certain parts of the city that we have defined, they either slow down or they stop completely. They cannot enter those areas. For example, very busy pedestrian areas, e-scooters cannot be used there. And there are certain areas where they cannot be parked. So someone who is riding an e-scooter cannot end their ride there. They cannot stop paying for it in specific parts of the city. Also, when the trial started, VOI made financial contributions so that the police increased their patrols and controlled the situation with these scooters, which later the police themselves said that they did not think it was necessary because they didn't identify any serious issues. But also we have taken some reactive measures. So there's an easy way for the public to report issues, and then VOI respond to these. Also, VOI have ambassadors on the street, so their own staff who will walk around the city and identify issues such as people riding on the pavement, and they issue what they call strikes. VOI operate a 3-strike system, so if you're caught riding on the pavement or causing any other problems with an e-scooter, users are given strikes. With the first one, they're banned for 7 days, and they have to complete some training to rejoin, to be able to ride an e-scooter again. And then with the 3rd strike, they're banned completely. They cannot ride a scooter again. And also there is a further feature which was introduced fairly recently after the beginning of the trial, which is called Parking Cop. And every rider at the end has to take a picture of the e-scooter, which shows how it has been parked. And if it hasn't been parked properly, VOI can issue fines up to £25. Also, just because I'm conscious I didn't say that, to give you an idea of where the trial is, at the moment it's covering the city centre, which is the area bound by the ring road, and also it goes to the north of the city, along the A34 corridor, and to the south of the city along the A38 corridor, and it also covers the University of Birmingham. We have 1,200 scooters at the moment, covering an area of 36 square kilometres. And this is my quick summary.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Joanna. That was very, very comprehensive, and yes, it's very good to hear about the what actions have been taken and some of the learning so far. I mean, it seems to me that the statistics about the mode shift. Well, I think we need to, probably that's one of the reasons for extending the trial, isn't it, to learn more about that? Because although it's very good that a third of the journeys would have been done by private car, it still seems to be that the biggest transfer is from walking or cycling. I mean, that's again another form of active travel.
Yes.
I'd like to throw the floor open for questions for members of the committee then. I've got some questions on my own, but I'll save them up to after colleagues have asked their questions. Zeka, I was about to say people were being uncharacteristically shy, but no, you've saved the day, Zeka. So do
Sorry, thank you.
Fire away.
Thank you for your presentation. Right, my quick question: are they allowed to ride on the road or footpath? Both of them.
Only on the road.
Only on the road.
Yes, and sorry, that's not correct. On the road, on cycling facilities, and in some shared pedestrian and cycling areas. Right. But definitely not on footways that are only footways.
Right. So I have seen in my ward so many driving on, the footpaths. So what can you do about those problems?
Yes. So this is certainly an issue that we're facing at the moment, both with the VOI scooters as well as with the private ones. So the measures that I have described, such as the ambassadors who are on the street and can see people riding on the footway, or reports by the public, are one way to reactively address these issues and issue fines to those who do it. Also, VOI run different training sessions where they will tell their users how to ride properly, and there is a lot of information on the app itself. So every time you will use the VOI app to start a journey, all users will be told they're not allowed to ride on footways.
Right. Have you found anybody so far?
Yes, VOI have issued a number of fines. I can find the statistics and give them to you. I should know, but at the moment I don't remember the numbers.
Yeah, I think that would be very helpful, Joanna, because I think when you briefed me, you and Carl briefed me, you had quite a lot of stats in here for incidences of riding on the pavement and some the other things that that are safety concerns. So yeah, that would be very helpful if we could circulate that around the committee afterwards. Okay, yes. I can see Tim, Hendrina, and Eddie all would like to ask questions. So Tim, over to you.
Well, I don't actually want to ask a question. I was just going to say I'm deliberately not asking a question. Because I've got the e-scooters members working group tomorrow. So I'm listening with great interest, but I'm going to save my questions for the working group.
That's good, because actually I've had this conversation with officers in the cabinet member, because the cabinet report that went in September actually I don't think really had any input from that working group before it was went to cabinet. So I think that's sort of an issue in the future to sort of synchronise engagement with that group. Because I'm going to let my other colleagues ask questions, but the questions that I've got are really about engagement with disabled people and the groups of and for disabled people. But I think there's a number of issues about how we engage a number of stakeholders. But anyway, I'll stop rabbiting on now. Hendrina.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for your presentation. You've just mentioned about the 3 zones: slow zone, no parking zone. I just missed the other one. Could you remind me the last one, please? And then the next one, you mentioned about legal scooters and the non-legal ones. So when all these scooters are out there on the road, how do you identify the legal ones and non-legal ones? And if you have identified the non-legal ones, what action has been taken so far? Thank you.
Okay. Firstly, I wanted to say that I did not say anything about engagement. We have worked with different groups across the city and nationally, and we're doing engagement events monthly, but I did not reference that. I'm sorry, I can give further detail. The zones are slow zones, no ride zones. So in the slow zones, any scooter will slow down up to 6 kilometers per hour. And a no ride zone, any scooter stops at its boundary, and no parking zones, people cannot end their rides there. In terms of illegal and legal and how we identify them, so I think in Birmingham it is quite easy. The Voi e-scooters are usually sturdier, so they look a little bit bigger than the private ones. They're also bright orange coral color, and they will say Voi on them, and they have a number plate. So they're all the same. On the private ones usually look flimsier, and they're either black or grey. They don't have any identifier on them. They might have the brand, but they don't have a number plate, for example. So these are the ways to tell them apart. What happens with the private ones is a matter of police enforcement. The West Midlands Police work with Transport for West Midlands as well as Voi to coordinate enforcement, and they have focused on this matter. A few months ago, they confiscated a few. There was an announcement on the news that they're taking action, but there's not much that the council can do. We refer people to the police. Have I missed anything?
Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome.
That's very helpful. Eddie.
Thank you, Chair. Obviously, my concern is through the private scooters, because driving buses, I see some silliness on the scooters. And when I spoke to, I won't name the officer, that they was only interested in the ones who are causing a few problems. That's either drug trafficking or pinching stuff. But as I say, it's not just adults you see on there, there's kids, and you see the same people using them. And the police cars go straight past. And we have a word with the Commissioner to let the force know any scooter on the road or pavement, if they're driving past, pull up, take it, throw it in the back and confiscate it, because it is annoying for some of the people with disabilities and that. And in Norfolk, they was trying to do wheelies on them. So it is a main concern, obviously, of mine and the safety of other people. So can we get the police force to agree that anything out of these zones will be picked up and scrapped straight away? Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Eddie. Any response on that, Jana?
We have engaged with the police, and we have pressured them to take this into account and take action. I cannot respond for the police. It is a complicated matter, even more so by the fact that the rules for the Voi scooters, or any legal ones in the country, say that people need to hold a valid driving license to ride them. And
it's a provisional license, isn't it? It's provisional license or higher. Yeah.
It's both provisional or full. Yeah. But in Birmingham, people also have to be over 18. Although a provisional license you can get from the age of 16, in Birmingham there's this extra rule that people have to be over 18. So that is checked by Voi, but with private ones there's no control.
Yeah, I mean, if I can just say that I'm aware that the PCC and his deputies have done some media work on their concerns about private e-scooters, and they are really lobbying the government to try and address the anomaly that these private e-scooters can be sold, but they can only be sold for use on private land. So for the majority of people, unless they're landed gentry, they're not going to have that much opportunity to use them legally. So I think that in a way they're learning from this pilot is that the only safe use is through the regulated pilots.
Can I add here that it is a complex matter, because even to legalize private e-scooters and introduce further regulation around them, this is primary legislation, so it will take a long time to introduce. Whereas with the ones that have been legalized, they have been legalized through emergency regulation for COVID. Swift action for the private ones is not possible. Legal action, I mean.
Yeah. But I think sort of the tenor of what was coming out of the PCC was more towards, could they, I mean, I don't know whether I'm misquoting, but my sense was that it was more towards, can they be, banned from sale? But I don't, because I just, I mean, they are all, the private ones, certainly, I've had some complaints from constituents, on the boundaries of my ward going into Northfield, where I think they're being used quite a lot in a dangerous way, the private ones. The questions, I'm just aware of time coming. I think we need to conclude this item in a few minutes, but just a quick question from me. You've alluded to the engagement work, and I know from reading the report and the appendices and the quality impact assessment and the very good briefing that you and Carl did for me, that there's ongoing engagement. But I think the key points from the particularly from the groups of and representing visually impaired people are about the location of docking stations. It's good that we've moved to have docking stations in the city centre, but I think one of their sort of key asks is that docking stations should preferably be located on the carriageway, because they're just really against anything which forms a new kind of obstruction on pavements. And I think anything that, a parked car, a shopping trolley, anything sort of left around that creates an obstruction for a visually impaired person, somebody walking with a white cane or with a dog. In the summer, I attended a roundtable organised by Thomas Pocklington and Guide Dogs for the Blind, and that was quite interesting, because there was a lady from the West Midlands Sight Loss Council talking about the experience of moving around in Birmingham city centre with her assistance dog, and she had a couple of incidents where a scooter has come right up behind her and the dog has been startled, and she was worried about her balance. So it's all those things like that, I think that we need to bear in mind. And that leads me on to the second thing, which, again, we've talked about before, Joanna, which is the trial of the acoustic alert systems on the scooters, because I think that's the thing that would allow visually impaired pedestrians to know that a scooter is somewhere in the vicinity. And there's work underway on this at the moment, isn't there? But if you could just tell us a bit more about that.
Yes. So in terms of parking on the carriageway, this is something that we are taking forward in specific parts of the city. To do this, we need to introduce an ETRO. So this work is progressing. It's on the pipeline. This does not, but I will say that this does not mean that all parking on the footway will be replaced by parking on the carriageway. This is we're moving towards a mixed approach, and we are. And Kurt can give more detail on this because he's leading on the operational side, but he's taking great care on where these bays are located on the footway, when they are located on the footway, and we have introduced racks rather than just digital parking location. We have physical racks on the footway, so he's working very hard to make sure that when they are on footway, they are not causing they're not causing a lot of issues. And in terms of the voice, the noise emitting feature on the e-scooters, Voi are doing a trial at the moment. So they are trialing this in Northampton, I believe. They're trialing a sound for the e-scooters, a continuous sound. But as I explained to you the last time we met, this is particularly challenging because the standards for the e-scooter device itself have been set nationally, and they determine, for example, the speed at which they can go, their design, but the noise emitting feature is not part of those standards. So whatever Voi will do locally will be over and above what the regulation is, and because it's not mandated, although they are doing it, it's even more challenging to push or to make it tailored to our needs.
Thanks, Jan. I thought I read in the report that there were 20 in the Birmingham fleet that are going to have this alert system on them. So obviously it's a small proportion of the overall number.
Yes.
But Yeah.
Sorry, I was wrong. I'm sorry. I was wrong to say it's only in Northampton. It's also in
Yeah.
Birmingham. I mixed up the different trials.
Not to worry. It's an interesting area of work, isn't it? Because the same issue is going to apply to electric cars, isn't it? Because those, when they're on the roads, in order for them not to be an extra hazard for pedestrians, they're going to need to make some sort of sound. And I assume that there's work going on, in research institutes on that as well. Thank you very much. I can just from the list participants list, I can see a couple of hands. Are they legacy hands, or is that new questions that you want to ask Tim and Eddie?
It's a legacy hand, I'm afraid.
All right, okay, okay, that's, yeah, I can see your hands gone down. Eddie, have you got a supplementary or no? Okay. Tim, your hand's gone up again.
No, I was trying to lower it.
Oh, right, okay, everyone satisfied their appetite for questions to Joanna. Well, I'm going to say thank you then, Joanna. That was a really comprehensive briefing, and yeah, thanks for answering the questions in such
Thank you. I will follow up with the statistics.
Yes, and I know you've got loads of statistics, so yes, look out for a very informative set of statistics to follow the meeting. Thanks very much for being with us this afternoon.
Thank you.
Great.
Bye bye.
Okay.
I'm going to leave.
No, that's fine. Yes, we know you've got things to do and places to be, other virtual places presumably.
So, if there are any other questions, you can email me directly. I'll leave my email in the chat.
Great. Thanks very much. Okay, so if we go back to the beginning of the agenda, then we've got the tracking on the tree policy. I've got Simon Needle here to talk to us. So thanks for waiting while we changed the order of the agenda, Simon, and over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. For those if anybody in there doesn't know me, I'm Simon Needle. I'm Principal Arboriculturalist within planning, and I've been working on the tree policy review and recommendations since the initial report in 2018. There's quite a lot of information that's come out with the pack for your review. The documents weren't quite ready to go live into the public arena, so they've just been kept for your councillors' view at the moment. So I'll just share the tracking report though, so you can see where we're going through at that time. Hopefully that's come up on the screen. So the original tree policy review took place in late 2017, with the recommendations coming forward for council in February 2018.
Simon, it's possible to make it any bigger because it's terribly small. That's the only thing. Yeah, great, perfect.
Okay, it's quite huge on my screen now. But that's the scroll through. So there was 12 recommendations came out of that, which we've been working to implement. Some of these are taking significantly longer, I think, than originally envisaged on the completion dates, and these generally due to the requirement from other work streams to bring things in line. So we'll run through quickly the recommendations, and if I've got time, I'll just quickly jump onto the Urban Forest Master Plan, which will be the last recommendation. So recommendation RO1 was around guidance on a range of tree-related matters, and that we would be putting out further information, especially in the Birmingham Design Guide, which is the planning document, around how trees need to be treated and considered and integrated into development and design, including the issues around water-sensitive urban design, use of sods and tree pits. Although the document was already started in September 2018, it's been held up for a number of reasons, and that's now been through public consultation. We held some workshops with industry and interested stakeholders during late 20 and early 21. The revisions of those, revisions of the document based on the comments received have been concluded, and the document is scheduled to be published in its final format for Cabinet in November 21 and full adoption by Council in January 22. I know it's been a considerable amount of time, but like I say, this is something that's being undertaken by colleagues within planning, so I've been very much at their hands in terms of timescale. However, I think the work that we've been doing on revising the details in there has been very well accepted, and the details are already being used to influence forthcoming documents. So if you've seen the Our Future City Plan vision document, particularly around City of Nature chapter, where we're looking at introducing significantly more greening in the city, both in terms of biodiversity value, but also for climate change adaptation and mitigation, and health and well-being aspects, then you'll see that we're sort of how much of an influence that has, looking at how we can work with the Birmingham Transport Plan to look at reallocation of road space and integration of green infrastructure into those spaces as well. And these documents, the Our Future City Plan and the Design Guide, are going to be influencing the revision of the local plan, and so that's scheduled to commence in the next 12 months. So hopefully once the Design Guide's been approved by Cabinet, then we should be, I suppose, have concluded this recommendation. Recommendation 2 was concluded previously. Recommendation 03 related to the assessment criteria and evaluation for planning conservation areas to ensure that discrepancies around tree protection are properly addressed in the event of a de-designation. At the time, there was some consideration of de-designating the Austin Village and Ideal Village, both of which were conservation areas. The issue there was the fact that trees within those areas automatically receive protection, and if we were to de-designate those, there would be no requirement for residents to consult City Council or seek prior consent for tree works. We've now worked through those. We've looked at the Austin Village and Ideal Village, and although there's no further plans for de-designation of other conservation areas, we've now got a good working relationship to ensure that all officers are aware of the need to engage with our arboricultural colleagues should any further consideration on boundaries, whether that be to extend or reduce boundaries for conservation areas going forward. So as that's now in place, I would like to think that we've concluded that one. RO4 and RO5 were also concluded. RO6 was looking around the feasibility of managing a percentage of tree cover on a citywide basis. Originally, it was to be explored with Amy to establish a mechanism so where options for replacing trees in a ward were limited, and with prior consultation, replacement trees can be planted in those areas where increased tree cover would be most beneficial. Some of those that have been looking at this for a while will be aware of the fact that we actually have got some measures of canopy cover across the city, and across the 69 wards in the city, we range from around 43% canopy cover for some of the Sutton wards down to as little as 9.6 for some of the inner city wards. In terms of delivery of ecosystem services benefits, urban cooling, those kinds of things, we can see that those people living in those deprived wards of canopy, and also they are tied to indices of multiple deprivation, are significantly disadvantaged by not having that access to green infrastructure and the benefits that it provides. So we have been doing a lot of work on that. The Kia have been put in place now, have taken over from Amy on an interim contract basis. So some minor revisions to the tree management practices were included in their contract, which include some of the considerations of tree planting locations based on need and ward canopy cover levels. There's no intent to decrease ward canopy cover levels where they exceed our sort of 25% threshold. The intention would always be to retain that level and certainly ensure that we've got sustainability and replacement planting going into those areas, and then consider where else we might be able to plant from that point onwards. So this, like I say, I mean, I know there was concerns about the fact that there might be thoughts around total removal of trees to plant elsewhere, but that's not the case. We're also going through a process of looking at tree equity. We're just, I think I'll probably pick this up oh no, it is, I've picked it up here. We've just been successful in working with Birmingham Tree People and gaining a grant through the 3D Hub, which is administered by the Centre for Sustainable Energy, to develop a web-based platform that helps with targeting of tree planting to provide greatest benefits to the citizens of Birmingham. And so that's based on a number of factors, which includes flooding, urban heat island, air quality, indices of multiple deprivation. If I haven't already said flooding, then flood risk as well. So that will be something that will be being used to guide tree planting activities as part of our Route to Zero call to action as well. So that's we're going to commence work on that platform next month, and hopefully by the time we get through to December or January, we should have the basis of the platform up and running, and that will be guiding tree planting then for the winter 22, so the 22-23 season. The above principles now are embedded in the policy document and embedded in the Urban Forest Master Plan and planning process as well. So we're recommending that sort of concludes that action there. RO7 was around the information to provide to the public around trees, and we've done some work on that. There is still a little bit of work to do around the web pages, especially cross-referencing, but I think as things seem to be in a bit of a state of flux in terms of how things are being managed and by who, that's sort of an ongoing matter. But planning tree officers have produced 2 documents which were supplied as part of the document pack to give out to those residents who are either living within a conservation area and seeking to apply for tree work, or for those that have trees protected by a tree preservation order. And they set out what we see as being best practice, and also recommendations for tree work and how work should be undertaken, to try and better advise them as to what good quality tree work is. There's a lot of tree surgeons out there, many of them doing good work, but we still do see some poor quality work, and that puts added financial pressure onto residents. We've also shared that document as well with Mainstay, who are the managing agents for Calthorpe Estates, and they've sort of been using that as well to help advise and guide their own staff, but also the residents within Calthorpe Estate. And I think, you know, we've also been engaged with Bourneville Village Trust, although they've just had some officer change over there. So hopefully we'll be rolling that out with them as well, and making sure that we're all sort of singing from the same song sheet. The other point that was,
while you catch breath, I've just seen that Constable Tim Huxtable has raised his hand. Did you want to come in there, Tim? Hello?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yes, good. I'm happy to wait to the end, but this would be a good time to come in, specifically because we raised the issue of tree preservation orders. And looking at the environment as a whole, I think there's one massive flaw in tree preservation orders, and that they don't include hedgerows. Or so where there's trees as part of a hedgerow, the trees are protected, but the hedgerow, as my understanding, isn't protected. So what we've seen is a lot of hedgerows, in some cases ancient hedgerows, being removed, which obviously contribute towards the Birmingham Canopy. But because they're hedges and not trees, there is very little that enforcement can do about it, because they're not covered by the tree preservation order. And I'm just wondering if Simon has any views as to how we can close that loophole and protect our hedgerows a lot better. And I've got a follow-up after Simon's comments.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. And I think, you know, I share your concerns on that. And as Joanna alluded to earlier, a lot of this is sort of primary legislation. So the tree preservation orders falls, you know, under the within the main planning legislation. So that comes out through from government. And so, you know, while we would want to include hedgerows in there, that they're not specifically mentioned, they are particularly only trees. And there are issues as well that that arboriculturalists see as well. The fact that things like dead wooding of trees is an operation that's excluded from the consent process, and yet dead wood, especially in ancient and veteran trees, is a particularly valuable biodiversity resource. And so there are these glaring omissions. I mean, I think apart from, you know, lobbying government to make these changes, you know, these issues keep being raised through, you know, the industry bodies to take back to government, and through people like Forest Commission as well. So I work with those, and we raise these issues on a regular basis. There is the hedgerows regulations, which would protect significant hedgerows. And if we were a rural county, then your significant hedgerows would be protected under that legislation. However, they seem to be de-designated because they're in an urban environment. I think we can use that to a certain extent if we can identify hedges of particular importance, and we can also flag those up on the nature conservation designation database. We do actually have some hedgerows already marked up on there. It's easier for us to comment and I suppose reject removals for hedgerows that are in BCC ownership, either through because they're on our land or they're part of the highway maintainable at public expense. But yes, it is difficult for those hedgerows that are on private land because there's no requirement for consent, and so yes, they're becoming defunct because there's piecemeal removals. I suppose yes, it just comes down to lobbying the government on this. But I think enough people are starting to say that hopefully we'll start to see some change.
Thanks, Simon. That's very informative response, and thanks for asking the question, Tim. If we let Simon continue, but it sounds like you need to open up a channel to Michael Gove, and we look at something. We need to look at some sectoral lobbying about this, because I can think of various areas where you've got the old field pattern of what was there before the houses were built and hedgerows. But do carry on now with the update on the tracking.
Sorry, I said I would have a supplementary.
Okay, can we save that to the end, just let Simon get through to the end of the presentation, just because we want to hear about the other recommendations.
Okay, I'll try and be quick. So one thing that we have done as well is about raising the awareness of the trees and value of trees. Is Birmingham Tree People, who are our tree warden group, have secured funding to commence work on a community engagement map. The provisional map is already out in the public realm. There's a link there that just has the BCC highways trees on it, but details the species, size, and the value of the ecosystem services they deliver individually and collectively. So it's somewhere around, I think unfortunately at the moment it's in dollars, but it's somewhere around £6.1 million annually they are delivering in ecosystem services. As funding becomes available, we're looking to expand on that, so that provide more detail about tree cover, but we'll also link into the tree equity map as well. The fact that R08 was about cities should raise awareness and promote the fact that Birmingham is committed to becoming one of the world's most environmental cities by being a member of the Biophilic Cities Network. So work has been continuing on that. We've tried to make reference within planning documents around biophilic city status and also biophilic design. In 2019, I did update you to say that we were making an application to the Arbor Day Foundation to become a Tree City of the World, which was a designation being offered by the United Nations Forestry and Agriculture Organization. We were successful in that first bid in 2019. So we were one of the first cities in the world to be awarded Tree City of the World status. There were 58 worldwide in that first year, and we were the only major city in the UK. There were 5 awards for the UK, with most of them being London boroughs, and I'm just trying to think of the other city. Can't think of the city now. It's one that I don't think of. I think it might have been Bradford, I think. But we were the first. We were the largest UK entry on that. We were successful in retaining that in 2020, and we were just about to make the application for 21 as well. But that has led to that status has led to us being invited to a number of online seminars, especially as there was a vast increase in those over the pandemic period. So I've been having to present on Birmingham's tree policy and strategy at local, national and international level over the last year. The most recent one is yet to come up, which will be at a United Nations European conference. Unfortunately, I don't get to go to Geneva. It's online, but there we go. So I suppose the pandemic has had the fortuitous side of raising the awareness of the natural environment and the importance of not only nature-based services they deliver, but also mental health and well-being benefits. And that and the impending environment bill have bolstered the cause for urban greening, which we've already mentioned is reflected in the City of Nature chapter of our Future City Plan, and biophilic city design being referenced in the design guide. Blue and green infrastructure also have their own work strand in the city's Route to Zero call to action, and that focuses on the delivery of the Urban Forest Master Plan and identifying sustainable tree planting opportunities. Also within the Urban Forest Master Plan, we have also identified the benefits that other green infrastructure play as well. So how green roofs and green walls can also play their part where tree canopy is not able to be provided because of constraints either on the land area or because of road space and utilities. So it's been taking some considerable time to for all these aspects, but they are aligning there. Where are we? So number 9, use of supplementary funding system, which uses the grading system. We agreed that we were going to be implementing CAVAT, which was the capital asset valuation of amenity trees. We'd already started to roll that process out through highways and integrated that into the highways design process. We've also been implementing it with Birmingham Municipal Housing Trust and a number of other departments as well. So Parks and Nature Conservation have been using that when dealing with utilities providers who need to access to sites and are looking to remove trees. We have now included that into the development management policies for Birmingham document, which has been through public examination and through planning inspectorate as well. They were happy with the details that we were putting in the process by which we would calculate the value of tree stock for development sites, and also how we would use that process to inform and lever in either supplementary tree planting or funding to deliver tree planting elsewhere in the city. So that policy document was due to be adopted this year, but again has been delayed because of the COVID pandemic. And I believe that also is going to Cabinet in either November or December for January adoption as well. So that actually writes the use of this financial process into the city's planning policy. And R10 was around the Urban Forest Master Plan, which seeks to put an overarching document in place, which will then be used to inform 5-year management plans and annual management plans coming out from that, with reporting periods on those. So we did have significant delays in that. I mean, again, we're still facing the same resource issue in terms of staffing, but again, working with our Birmingham Tree people as our partner, we were able to secure some funding to bring in additional external resource and work with them and other stakeholders to bring this master plan into being. We were able to engage a company called Treeconomics, and also through our own connections and through connections with them, engage with some national and international experts as well as other local stakeholders to develop that plan. We held a number of online workshops through early 21 to come forward with a vision statement and a whole series of performance indicators on what they look like. And then we've been working in the background to put all the data behind those and look at our performance level and see where we are performing, where we're not performing, what we need to be picking up on. So I have shared that report with you. We've still got a final bit of typing and formatting just to finish on there, and the introduction as well. But we're looking to be putting that document out into the public realm, hopefully some point in October. So following the sign off of that document, though, we'll then commence on aligning our existing tree policy documents, which we have in place, putting them into a new format so they match the Urban Forest Master Plan, and probably adding in some new policy around, policy documents around tree planting and biosecurity as well, especially. So biosecurity being looking at where plants are being moved to and from and ensuring that we're not introducing new pests and diseases. And then obviously R11 was around terms of reference for a representative region-wide independent-led Birmingham Forest Group. We have put together a set of terms of reference for a tree board. It did say they're included in the document pack, and I realised that I neglected to include that. So as we said, we'll have to have a formal meeting to sign these off. I can make sure that we've got that in time for that. But that has been circulated and provisionally agreed by the core stakeholder group. So that's mainly the stakeholders and interested parties who've been involved in the delivery of the Urban Forest Master Plan. And at that point, that group, so both internal and external stakeholders, will take on responsibility for overseeing the delivery of the Urban Forest Master Plan and progress to an update of the performance indicators based on the KPI monitoring. But we would suggest that there needs to be an annual report to either to Cabinet or to this group to show progress towards delivery of those KPIs. I'm sure it was something that you'd be interested in on there. And so that's what we were saying in recommendation R12 was that this was about having a tracking report to present to overview and scrutiny. So that's where we've suggested that. I don't know whether I can just swap the tab. Have you now got a different page up, or do I need to stop sharing?
Yeah, got the vision statement. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So the Urban Forest Master Plan is 56 pages long, so I'm not going to go through all of this, but the vision statement that's here was co-created by the workshop group. It took a bit of time to bring it down to this, I have to say, but basically the vision statement will be for having more trees for Birmingham that deliver benefits for health, nature and climate change for all the communities within the city now and in the future as part of an inclusive and sustainable urban forest. And that was trying to encapsulate all the aspects that the urban forest can play. If you've had the chance to have a look through the document, you'll see, you'll see that at each section we've put a table at the start which sets out the key performance indicators and then performance levels against low, moderate, good and optimum, and then a priority for action on here. The reason why I brought this page up is just to sort of highlight that you'll see that we've got quite a few as you go through that are moderate or low. And the reason for this is because although we have data at a city level, so in terms of city council level, on our own tree stock, the Urban Forest Master Plan is considering all of the trees within the city boundary, so those within private ownership and large landowners as well, so Calthorpe Estates, Bourneville Village Trust, Cadbury's, universities. So this has actually dropped down our performance on one or two of these because we don't have that data yet, but we are working with those, well, certainly with the large landowners to try and gather that data. And we've identified what we need to do in order to bring our performance levels up on there. Relative tree canopy cover, I've mentioned previously that the city's at 18.6% canopy cover. That's the figure that we recognise internally, but we were aware in undertaking this exercise that other organisations such as the Forestry Commission and one or two others have used other methods of calculating canopy cover that give a varying figure to our own. So we are going to determine which method of calculating the canopy cover we are going to use. Once we've done that, we'll be up in the sort of good performance on there because we'll be using the same methodology every time we recalculate that.
Can you just show that you just flicked past it, but when I was looking through this morning, that the map, you know, of the tree cover in this document is very telling. Because
that one there.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, so that map there, so the relative tree canopy cover, yeah, this is actually taken from Sentinel satellite data, but we have got the same sort of mapping through an iTree canopy study, which uses randomly selected plots. But yes, you can see that the map that we would normally use is a bit more detailed and actually has this internal white area filled in. So Borsley Highgate, for instance, which probably sits around here, is 9.6% canopy, and this is one of the areas of concern for us because, you know, this is an area where we're looking at changing the occupancy from small business to residential. If you look at the Birmingham Development Plan, we're talking about potentially putting 23,000 additional people into there. So we need to increase the amount of green infrastructure and canopy cover. Otherwise, you know, these are the areas that mirror high urban heat islands, so which will reflect, you know, increases in years life lost, early premature death, etc. So it's a bit harsh and stark, I suppose, like that. But yes, you can see the Sutton wards to the north there, very green. I think this lower canopy cover one here might be Falcon Lodge, which is the only ward that features higher up in the indices of multiple deprivation in the Sutton area. And then so we've got places like Edgbaston, Bourneville, and heading out into Yardley, which have got quite high canopy cover. And then you've got sort of Quinton, Bartley Green, etc. there. So yeah, this is particularly stark in this
I think it shows up very powerfully the need to green. It's not deprived areas, but also the city centre. Because I mean, the city centres look, the bits that have been finished in the latest round of regeneration look fantastic, but there's still not enough greenery. I think that just shows why the vision for the city centre is really important. Okay,
yeah.
Tim's got his follow-up question and any new questions, and then Councillor Freeman, Eddie. So Tim, do you want to follow up?
Yes, thank you very much. And I think when Adam pointed, when he said heading out towards Yardley, he actually meant heading out towards Hall Green.
Hall Green, sorry, yes.
Yes, or Yardley Wood as well. But okay, we will put that to one side. But this sort of plays into my point is where wards have high coverage of tree canopy. The bigger issue is not planting more trees, but the maintenance of existing trees to keep them healthy, but also to stop other issues with them. And, while I still get many requests for additional tree planting, which is very, very welcome, and do my best, I'm getting an increasing number of complaints about the lack of maintenance to those trees, which do result in trees falling down onto the public highway, but also means the obstruction of both the carriageway and pedestrian walkways, pavements, etc., etc. So what can we do better in terms of maintenance citywide? And obviously that's covered by the PFI contract, and I understand that. But there are where the hedges are BCC assets, they're in our asset register, but they're excluded from the PFI. And what can we actually do to better maintain those trees and to make it easier for pedestrians to walk along the pavements without being scratched by them, and to improve visibility along roads where the tree canopy overhangs?
Thanks, Tim. I'm going to ask Councillor Freeman to come in with his question, just so that we can collect a few questions. So Eddie, go ahead.
Obviously, I mean, I'm all for planting trees, but I mean, we lost a lot of trees in some of my road had 35 trees. It's down to 1 tree. I know there's roads where trees are lost completely. Where if you look at the old mapping when these estates were built, you have all the tree information there. I mean, we know Birmingham Cable killed a lot of the trees, as I've said in the past, because they're cutting the roots off and the trees automatically die. But I'm all for putting some of these trees back into these roads where we've lost them. And also I follow up Tim's concern about the tree maintenance, we've got to look into these both things. People want the trees and putting the right trees in the roads, because we've got some roads, we've got conker trees in, or big oak trees, obviously have took up the pavements, and roots have followed the drainage system and blocked up some of the drain systems up, and that. We've got to really look at this and plant a lot more trees, because over the years we've probably lost about 1 million trees in the city, in the Midlands area. And obviously when I lived in the back-to-back houses, and people with chest problems was moved out to these areas, Longbridge, Wheelie Castle, Bartley Green. So yeah, I'm all for trees, and just plant them as quick as we want, because they seem to take them down and you don't see a tree put back in the same road or whatever reason. Thank you.
Thanks, Eddie. And Zeka, just if you could ask your question as well.
Okay, thank you. Following up on those questions, in my ward, South Yardley, we have a lot of trees, and they're quite old, very old. Some of them are over 50, 60, or probably 100-year-old. And to maintain them, it's very difficult. And some of them trees are conker trees. And recently we have experienced a lot of flooding in some of the areas. And they are causing a lot of problems. And also the tree roots are lifting from footpaths as well. So what is the best way to maintain those trees? And I'm sure we want to keep those trees, but we need to maintain them properly so they're not hazard for residents. And also, what is our policy on the canopy hanging over private properties, because I have one couple of residents. I went to visit one of the residents. They're in their 80s, and canopies hanging over their property, and they got pigeons, those pigeons, and they got droppings in their garden and in their footway, and it is very distressful for them. And they are, I believe, poisonous as well. I'm not sure, but that's what I've been told. So, what is the best way to, make sure that those kind of residents not affected? Also, I went to visit one disabled lady yesterday, and she said to me, the trees are on the road, but they are hanging over the property, and she only got a small garden, and she needs to sit in the garden. But when she sits in the garden, she can't even take a chair there, and because they're all mess up, and she can't even take a food or tea to drink in the garden. And she said, she has requested so many times to tree to be pruned back, but nothing has been done. So could you please just tell us what is our policy? Thank you.
Thanks, Zeke. So Simon, there's quite a group of questions there, really focusing on tree maintenance and all those aspects.
Okay, right. So, if I start with the hedgerows first, then. So, yes, the trees within hedgerows would fall within the PFI contract, but the hedgerows were left within the grounds maintenance contract. I think there was to be quite frank with you, I know this is sort of going out beyond just us here, but my experience is that when the contract went over to the PFI contract, Highways asked Parks how much it was going to cost to manage the green space. Parks seemingly forgot to include all of the other works that were on ad hoc work orders. So as far as Highways are concerned, they're paying for all of the green estate management. As far as Parks are concerned, they weren't getting money for some of the things that weren't on programme. So that is a real issue. I think the opportunity is now that all of the grounds maintenance contractors come back in-house. It's no longer split between 3 different providers. There needs to be a complete reassessment of that grounds maintenance and identify all of these anomalies that were once on an ad hoc works order but are no longer weren't included in the programme works. I mean, I'm very much aware of that because I get a lot of the inquiries about overhanging vegetation from hedgerows as well. There are issues also as well with private individuals not managing their hedgerows, which requires us to serve some kind of enforcement notice on them. So there's a number of issues where somebody's planted a conifer hedge as part of their boundary and doesn't maintain the outer edge. But yeah, the bigger ones on the highways itself, that's an issue that needs to be picked up with Parks and how that's going to be included in part of the estate management. In terms of tree maintenance, I think there's a number of strands here. I think people have got too used to seeing things over managed, and when they don't see us coming around regularly cutting trees back, they think that we're not maintaining them, when actually they don't need maintenance. Trees evolved 350 million years ago. They evolved and lived without our intervention for probably what is about 340 something million years plus. So that, yeah, it's only because we are intervening in their environment, I suppose, that we need to do things. But fully understand that we can't have trees obstructing highway. We can't have trees causing damage to properties. So at the moment, if there's damage or disease or decay in a tree, then that will be pruned out. That's identified as part of the cyclical survey of the trees. All of the trees in the city have a full assessment every 5 years, but they're also picked up on annual inspections as well, especially those around housing areas and those on the highways. So the highways inspectors will look out for obvious defects in trees and relate those back to the tree manager for any further investigation and works. The sucker and feather work on the highways, that is also on a cyclical basis as well. That should be undertaken periodically. I can't think of the frequency, but I think it's all of those trees get done once a year, but I'm not quite sure at which point they'll be done. But there's 75,000 street trees to cover. I mean, admittedly, we used to do a lot of I suppose what people might call as pollarding, but basically it's topping and reduction of the canopies, and that is quite an expensive practice to keep redoing. It also means that the regrowth from those trees is fairly weakly attached to the tree and is more likely to break out. So what we've been trying to do since the start of the BFI contract is revert these back to a more natural form of canopy and reduce that management. What we will do is we'll remove anything that's within 2 meters of a property. So if it overhangs a property boundary and the tree is safe, in a safe, sound condition, there'll be no management of that, no cutting back. But if it's within 2 meters or it's touching a property where there's damage going to be occurred, then those will be pruned back to provide appropriate clearance. It wouldn't really be possible to prune every tree back to a boundary line. It would impact the trees significantly. It would reduce the amount of canopy cover in the city as well, and the cost of doing that and repeatedly doing that would be horrendous. However, all residents have a common law right to prune back overhanging vegetation to their boundary. That would have to be undertaken from the ground or within their property. That doesn't help most of the residents, I know, but that's how it goes in terms of I suppose of common law, custom and practice. Let me think. Putting trees back in streets. Yeah, I mean the government have got a directive to sort of try and get more trees in streets. There certainly had been a shying away of putting trees back in streets as part of development because of the ongoing management costs. But under the PFI contract, if a tree was removed from the highway, then one would be replaced back in the highway as part of that. However, in between a tree being there, originally planted, and then it having to be removed and a replacement going in, there's probably a whole host of utilities been put into that location, which has restricted putting trees going back into certain locations. And also the proliferation as well of footway crossings has also restricted the amount of area that we have to put trees back into.
Simon, I'm going to ask you to,
yeah,
I think I'm going to ask you to bring it to a close there, because I'm just aware that we don't want to shortchange the item about the LTP consultation. But I hope, and as I know, you've helped me so much with my own casework. I know that if members have got detailed queries, that you're always happy to deal with queries by email and to offer help and advice. But really, what I wanted to say was, I think it's, I'm really pleased with the progress that's been made against this the tree policy inquiry. And as you said, there have been some constraints that have been to do with the pandemic and the underlying issue of very thin staffing levels. But I think you've shown a lot. There's a lot of progress, and things like the Urban Forest Master Plan. And the tree board and those big sort of strategic things that are going ahead, and the influence they're starting to have on other planning policies and frameworks seem to me hugely significant. So I've taken with some of the names, like the Birmingham Tree People sounds like some sort of indie rock band, and the Treeconomics. Yes, I quite like that. Yeah, quite like that as a tag. So thank you very much for taking the time to bring us up to date on all of that. And as I say, congratulations on all the work that's been done. And I think that map, with that white space, in the city centre and all of the inner city wards, I think that we should all be, it's a social justice issue as well, isn't it? And that's been really in the front of our minds during the pandemic. The access to green space and trees is just so important. Yeah. So the ongoing monitoring that you're talking against, the KPIs, I think that is going to continue to interest this committee, in the future, whoever's on it and whoever's chairing it. But thanks very much for being with us today, and yes, enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Yep, thank you.
Great. Okay then. So our last item on today's agenda, substantive item, is the presentation and discussion on the West Midlands Local Transport Plan consultation, and we've got David Harris and Alex Greathead with us. So who's going to do the presentation?
Good afternoon, everyone. Alex and I are going to do a bit of a double act on this one. So we'll do it between us. So Alex is going to share his screen.
Excellent. Yeah, it's Alex Greatholder, isn't it? Sorry, Alex, I got your name wrong there, but yes.
It's okay.
So yeah, good afternoon everyone. I'm David Harris, Transport Strategy and Policy Manager, and just introduce us, Alex.
So I'm Alex Greatholder, Principal Policy Officer at Transport for West Midlands as well. So
we're just going to run through some slides just to give you an overview of the green paper that's been published and how we're going to take things forward on the local transport plan. So I'm just going to start off with a bit of background to the role of the West Midlands Combined Authority in Transport for West Midlands. So essentially we're the transport arm of the Combined Authority. We have a legal duty to produce a local transport plan that covers the 7 metropolitan districts and boroughs of the West Midlands. And that LTP needs to sort of balance out competing transport issues and different kind of demands. So the need to sort of obviously support economic growth, but at the same time, the need to manage and offset sort of harmful impacts to people and of course to the environment. And ultimately, LTP sort of sets out those policies and then starts to frame the priorities for investment and other action that we need to take in the region. So quite a lot's gone on since we published the last LTP. That was Movement for Growth, and that was published and adopted back in 2016. And that was just at the very start of the Combined Authority and Transport for West Midlands coming into existence. And we've seen various things such as the Inclusive Growth Framework being developed, which sort of talks about and sets out a new way of thinking about and approaching investment and prioritising how we go about making sure that prosperity reaches as many people as possible across the region. We've seen things like the local industrial strategy developed, and that's also helped set out in terms of particularly around the future of mobility, a key strength for the West Midlands in those sectors. We declared a climate emergency back in 2019, and that's set regionally and a more ambitious target than where the government currently are with their 2050 net zero target. And that requires us to look at how we might respond to that challenge. And of course, we've had the pandemic, which has had quite significant implications for our communities, the economy, and also as a result of how transport is operating and perhaps needs to be planned and managed in the future. So lots changed quite quickly, really, and our fourth LTP, which is, say, Movement for Growth, sets out sort of an approach to how we're going to tackle these issues. But the region has exploded in the last century or so, and our populations have grown, and as a result, as transport has improved and mobility has perhaps got easier and cheaper, that's affected how and where we've lived, and therefore the urban form of the West Midlands. So we've gone from relying on walking and horses to railways to motorised road vehicles very quickly. And as we've built more cars and more infrastructure, we've then seen our settlements expand and so on. And we've also seen an improvement in wider communications. So we've gone from at the turn of the century, we might have sent a telegram. Now we can sort of do anything on our mobile phones wherever we are, and the world has changed. And in some ways that's allowed us to sort of offset some of the travelling that we've done, perhaps for work, but we may now travel more for leisure because we've freed up some of that time. It's probably just worth sort of reflecting on the graph on the left of the screen here, which shows the sort of in Great Britain passenger miles by mode since 1904. And the sort of 3 lines along the bottom, motorcycles, buses and coaches and rail-based transport, sort of don't really change that much. And the sort of green line, you sort of see peak bus sometime in around 1950. But the purple line, which shoots off, is passenger miles by car. And post sort of World War II, during the 50s and then into the 60s, we see the number of passenger miles by car just skyrocket. So we now travel more than we ever have before. And that's really important as we sort of think about our new LTP, because that's a problem we need to get to grips with. Within the same context and that same period, we've seen some of those costs for those other modes go up in real terms against the cost of motoring and perhaps buying a car, which has either stayed quite similar, in some cases even gone down. So that again has presented challenges and has in part where we've arrived to some of that consumption of mobility in the way that we have it now. And something else that we'll come back to later on in the presentation is this issue around where some of that travel is now going. Whereas before it might have been quite focused onto very core routes, where public transport really did play a good sort of alternative. What we have now is lots of journeys that don't start or finish in a strategic centre, and therefore the opportunity for public transport to change or take on some of those journeys is much reduced. So, as I say, a lot's changed very quickly, and transport's shaped our region. So we've gone from a small set of towns and cities to a large urban area now with over 3 million people. And obviously land use has a big influence on how we've travelled, and we can now access far more places than we could ever travel to before. And that sort of change in transport's also sort of changed the urban form of our environments. And pre-mass car ownership, we had sort of reasonably permeable, tight streets, terrace streets that weren't designed for the motor car, but still provided reasonable good walking accessibility to sort of wider places. What we've seen then in sort of that mass car ownership era is developments built largely around the car, but not always designed in the best way for them. And they're less permeable, lots of cul-de-sacs and so on, which then supports and encourages more trips by car because it's actually more difficult to walk and cycle. So we've gone from very quickly places that a world where perhaps 100 years ago we might have gone to Blackpool for our summer holidays if we were lucky, and now pretty much we could travel to anywhere on the planet. And at the same time, just worth reflecting on, even sort of during the sort of mass car ownership era of post-war, we've seen the car change quite a lot, from quite small vehicles, quite light, not necessarily that energy efficient, to much larger vehicles. So that's a Mini Cooper, sort of the one on the right, obviously on steroids. And that's kind of, in that 50 years, we've seen this kind of trend towards bigger, heavier vehicles, which in essence have cancelled out. So those efficiencies in internal combustion engines mean that our use of energy for transport continues to grow in light of these things. And we've seen a microcosm of change in the last 18 months. So the pandemic has really affected transport in quite significant ways. And we're starting to see where we're kind of going out the back of the pandemic now and what recovery looks like. And unfortunately, that's kind of a bad news story in some ways, in that we're seeing quite a rapid return to car-based travel, but a much slower return to public transport. And that does raise questions and challenges for how we might plan and manage the transport system going forward, particularly if we're not able to have the commercial support for a public transport system that we currently do. We know that people are adaptable to change. We also know that people saw some benefits from the changes that we saw in terms of the quieter streets and the cleaner air. And those are sort of the key things that we need to reflect on, because we know that people are keen to see change. We just need to think about how we might shape that new strategy to give us some of those change, whilst not going too far in terms of the bad behaviours of over excessive car use and low public transport use, which we may end up in if the sort of the recovery from the pandemic does not go in the right direction. I think it's just worth saying at this point as well that it's not all bad news, and we have been doing some really great stuff as a region over the last 5 years and longer, and we've been, Movement Growth really helped to sort of secure funding to enhance our rapid transit network. We're building new metro extensions, we're delivering sprint routes and other bus improvements, and we're doing a lot around active travel with the sort of Starley routes and improvements to the sort of cycling infrastructure, and those wraparound elements as well that make the transport system easier to use and to help us manage it better. So things like Swift and then the Regional Traffic Coordination Centre are just helping to improve that offer all round to make transport across the region easier. But that doesn't mean that necessarily all the things we do have all been the right things to do. And I think as we go into the new LTP, that's going to be some of the questions we have to ask ourselves and appraise and consider if the strategy we have been delivering is the right one, and we'll come back to that shortly. So I'm just going to hand over to Alex, who's going to just now talk through the motives for change that we set out in the Green Paper.
Brilliant. So, yeah, one of the key concepts that the Green Paper that we've published explores is these motives for change. So the best way to think of these is kind of how we've translated some of the key issues that we see within transport that stand in the way of inclusive growth. So inclusive growth being that new way of thinking about how we advance the region where the social economic benefits are contributed to more equitably and benefited from more equitably, but also that we are staying within our environmental ceilings. So we're not putting our environment at jeopardy, which ultimately we depend on for our future prosperity. So we pulled out these 5 motives for change where we feel there's those core issues to resolve. None of them we're saying is any more important than any of the others. They're kind of they're not really comparable, to be honest. It's not really a case of which ones of these do we want, and we're not saying there's specific tensions between them. It's how do we move forward in a way in which we are making progress across all of these agendas. And that's our challenge with the public, is to talk about what are the ways in which we can change transport in order to make that happen. So starting off obviously with sustaining economic success is a key motive. We've had a lot of success in the past since the turn of the century, I guess, and we want that to continue. And we know that transport and the economy are intrinsically linked. So if you've got more economic activity going on, that often means people are doing more stuff, more goods are being moved, more people are being moved. So one of the ways in which we try to encourage economic growth through transport policy is to make that movement easier, so we reduce travel barriers to help people connect with the people or the businesses and places, and that's something that every civilization has done, since the dawn of modern society. But the problem that we've got is the way in which we reduce travel barriers, where we do that in an untargeted and incoherent way, that can end up being detrimental to our ability to sustain economic success, and create new issues as well that begin to detract from our economic successes. So cutting to the nub of it, I suppose the way in which we move around right now, our current transport system, it's not particularly efficient. So the vehicles that we use don't use our constrained space in our urban area particularly effectively. We use really heavy vehicles. When you think about the weight of a person, I'm going to be really generous and say certainly on average less than 100 kilograms, and a vehicle being 1,000 kilograms or more. These are really heavy vehicles we use to move people around, and those vehicles cause a lot of wear on our infrastructure, and cost a lot of energy to move as well. We get congestion with the way in which we travel at the moment, and that starts to mean it's difficult for greater growth to occur in those congested areas, and it's also more difficult for people to get to the opportunities in those congested areas. So if we continue to focus our economic development within congested areas, not only is it going to be more difficult to sustain, but it's more difficult to spread the benefits of that growth to people further away. And we also have all sorts of harmful impacts from all the traffic that we generate on people and places, which have direct costs to our economy, through things like just the tax that ends up being needed to pay for health services and things like that. That's kind of a drag on the economy, which can be avoided, but also there's opportunity costs as well. So we could be more productive if we were healthier. Our area may be more investable if it was seen as a more pleasant place to live in, where people can enjoy a better quality of life. And often when we've focused on reducing those travel barriers, we focus on building new links and improving travel times to distant locations. But the way in which we do that tends to be a more direct benefit from those who are already pretty mobile. So whether that's through rail travel, which we know it tends to be, in terms of when you're looking at passenger profiles tends to be those on higher incomes, but also when we're adding extra links in our road network, you know, you're adding one link in a network that's already quite well developed. Whereas what we've got in the urban area is we've got a lot of people who don't have a car, who don't benefit from some of those investments, and also those who perhaps can't afford rail. And actually they're in a situation without a car where they have relatively limited access to economic opportunities already because of their poor mobility, and that's hampering their you know, the potential that they represent in their ability to contribute to and benefit from access to more opportunity to contribute to our economy. So when we try to increase capacity in the transport system to address some of our pinch points and things like that, the other thing that we end up doing is you know, continuing to bake in some of those issues. So I guess at best it feels a bit like being in a submarine with lots of leaks, and you've only got so many fingers to kind of plug those gaps. Once you've kind of dealt with one issue, another issue springs up elsewhere, and that's not sustainable to continue. So the proposition within the Green Paper really is that we could change our focus on how we get transport to better sustain and unlock economic growth by focusing on using the infrastructure we've actually got better. So we've got absolutely enormous amount of infrastructure, road networks, rail networks, and everything in between that we could leverage more benefit from. And we can focus on levelling up the mobility of those who are currently more constrained to enable them to better contribute to the economy, whilst reducing some of those harmful impacts of transport as well, which end up being a drag. And the great thing as well is, you know, in our local industrial strategy, you know, the future mobility grand challenges drawn out as a key opportunity for the West Midlands. You know, including Birmingham, because we have so many strengths here in the area, and that's not just about our automotive industry. That's also, you know, even you know, things like, you know, National Express as a you know, really significant employer within the public transport sector as well, and beyond them. So great opportunity to leverage local expertise. Moving on, the Green Paper talks about, you know, how we can create a fairer society, and this is kind of a story of two halves around equity in the transport system in terms of the opportunities people can access, what that means for social mobility, but also the harmful impacts that it can have on people. So whilst we've become more car dependent, and whilst places and business models have been built around an assumption that people are highly mobile because of cars, actually 1 in 4 households in the West Midlands don't have access to a car. That's not a small number of people. That's a really significant you know, proportion of our population. But actually beyond those households that don't have a car at all, when you look at the households that do have a car, they don't have a car for every single adult that's living there. So there's plenty of people you know, who don't benefit from that level of mobility. And when you start to look at the differences as well between the households with and without cars, and between the people within households who get primary access to cars, you can see that there are patterns in terms of who ends up benefiting directly more from that vehicle. And it tends to be that women and younger people, disabled people, those from deprived backgrounds and ethnic minority groups are all less likely to have access to a car. So that's a real fundamental systemic issue with the way in which our transport has evolved. Is you've got a very significant proportion of our population who are effectively marginalised, and the way in which that marginalisation happens is discriminatory. And when you look, and you compare, so that's a really significant issue in terms of the number of people impacted, but also when you look at the gap in access between those people who perhaps can benefit from a car and those that can't, it's a really, really big gap, and that's kind of what the maps here on the right show, with jobs accessible within 45 minutes by car or without a car, and you can see, these are kind of worlds apart, which is fundamentally means that not having a car within our urban area means that those people have access to a much narrower range of opportunities and choices, which is a barrier to social mobility. The challenge for us really is that gap can't just be bridged by making buses more frequent, putting in bike lanes and things like that, or even making public transport free. So if we want to level up people's access to opportunity to match that's provided by a car, we would need to think very differently about other options that perhaps provide a more affordable and higher degree of independent mobility without all the harmful impacts of a car. So to think really beyond some of those solutions that we focused on in the past. Looking beyond the inequity in access, I said that there's an inequity in the harmful impacts of transport as well. So things like road casualties and air pollution and noise and more. And actually, that those impacts, that they obviously stem from the behaviours and choices of people who are more mobile. If you're, if you're driving around more, you're creating more impacts. However, the communities that tend to be more acutely affected are those who are more deprived. So they tend to live in places where they are more exposed to the impacts of traffic, heavily trafficked areas, but also they often have pre-existing conditions, which means they end up being particularly vulnerable as well to those those intense impacts. So the challenge with that one is, addressing that inequity fundamentally requires changing the behaviours and consumer choices of the people that are responsible for generating those impacts. The people that are being affected have little control over that, which is something that we can address. Moving on then, the Green Paper talks about the impacts of transport on local communities and places. So as traffic and vehicle ownership has increased, motor vehicles have increasingly dominated the function of the function and space available in streets, which has harmed the quality of places and limited opportunities to use those streets for wider functions that might deliver greater social and economic value to communities. And pictures up in the top right, kind of trying to really make the point about what streets used to be used for, and perhaps now, when you ask parents whether they would feel safe with their children being able to go out and play on the street, many will say no. Not all because of transport reasons, but a lot of it is. And those problems that are faced are particularly acute in particular places that were developed before mass car ownership. So those urban environments within which there's just limited off-street parking. And many of those streets you'll be familiar with, kind of getting to the point now where they are either nearly full or they are full and overspilling. You can see it as you drive around or move around our region, with no room for further growth in car ownership. And the problems have worsened as well with increasing prevalence of larger vehicles. So we need to think really carefully about how we want those streets to be in the future, how we can change them to better manage those kinds of impacts. It's not just about reducing the impact of traffic on streets, though. We also think that there's an opportunity to look at how we could improve what people can access locally as well, in terms of how transport supports those local communities and places. So one of the observations that we've, is worth reflecting on is people want to have access to their basic amenities within a walking distance. And most people do. Most people do have access to a core set of services. But the issue really is that lack of choice, that lack of diversity, the amount of choice, but also the quality of choices that are there. And that's something that we should, we can look at how we can improve that as well. And so there's a direct case where we can look at the barriers locally in the transport system that might reduce the accessibility of some of those local amenities. But in many cases, that might actually be the transport system itself, which is creating a barrier. So heavily trafficked roads creating severance through communities. Becoming more active as well. So a really big opportunity to think about how transport can better support our health. So it's a real key area where we've advanced economically, socially. But that hasn't necessarily gone hand in hand with the kind of outcomes you would expect with health. So you'd have thought we'd be living longer. That has started to be questioned now. We've seen that life expectancies aren't going up anymore, and we can see, a significant portion of that is down to our lifestyles that we've now got. So we've got better medicine and lives. Lives less perilous. but we're much less physically active, and that is as a result of not just transport, although that is one aspect, but also the nature of our work. So, and that's a problem that's getting worse with successive generations. You know, when you're looking at kind of the statistics around obesity levels in children, it's really, really worrying. They're going to deal with some serious health effects as they grow up. And so there's questions we can ask ourselves about, you know, how is it that we can change perhaps the way we travel and the transport environment to make it easier for citizens to lead a healthier life where they can work physical activity back into their day-to-day routine through transport. Finally, then, in terms of the big 5 motives for change, is the climate emergency, arguably the biggest environmental challenge that we face in terms of its, you know, the scale of it and the proximity, and a real challenge for transport as well, because transport is the biggest in the UK and the West Midlands. It's the biggest sector for carbon emissions. And when you look at what's happened over the last 30 years, we've had more efficient engines, but travel demand has gone up and vehicle size has gone up, and that's meant that transport emissions by and large have kind of flatlined. So we're really at the point now where transport stands out. It's the biggest sector, as I say, and if we're going to decarbonise the West Midlands and the UK, it's got to start shifting. And that change has to happen quickly. For those of you, you'll be aware of the climate emergency agenda. You know, there's a number of targets, the local and national level, but everyone agrees, you know, when you take it back to the Paris Agreement, which is all about avoiding our projected, you know, what is projected to be an unacceptable temperature increase by 2030. We've got to avoid that point. So we need to have significant change within the next 9 years, soon to be 8 years.
Alex,
Sure.
can I just interrupt briefly? You're right, this is absolutely the crux of the matter, isn't it? The existential threat. But can I ask you to just draw it to your presentation to a conclusion, so that we've got some time for
Sure, yeah,
discussion? Yeah,
that's fine. So I don't want it to seem like it's just dwelling on the issues that we've got. The thing is called Reimagining Transport in the West Midlands, and you know, there really is a great opportunity to rethink the way that we're doing things and to do that at pace. So some of the key reflections in terms of what we've got to do. One of the key concepts is around, we can't be thinking about just about mobility in terms of how people access opportunity, because access to opportunity is not just dependent on that. So it is also dependent on the way that we're using land and the way in which we use digital technologies like we are today. So that's a really key thing that we need to understand if we're going to get a bit better balance between how people are able to access things and the harmful impacts of transport. That's really key to understand. And also a general message that, you know, there are actually lots and lots of ways of being mobile that are better than what we're currently relying on, which is by and large the car. It's the only mode that we've ever used that's more frequent than walking. And as it kind of says on the right here, and I said it earlier, all motives important, but the climate emergency is unique in the way that it delivers a sense of urgency around the pace at which we need to act. And also, we know that we're not going to be able to decarbonise fast enough with electric vehicles and with hydrogen vehicles. And so actually there is a need within decarbonisation to look at how we can change our travel behaviours as well.
So I'll just take back over and wrap this up. So essentially within the Green Paper, we talk about 3 things around sort of avoid, shift and improve. So avoiding travel. So like we're doing now, we haven't all travelled to have this meeting, some of you are at home. But there are things that we can do around consolidating those trips, and some of that might apply to freight, for example, but equally some of the trips that we make that might be personal mobility trips, we might need to find ways of consolidating those. Obviously, we need to continue shifting those things and trips where possible to sustainable modes, and we need to continue to improve. And whilst, as Alex said, EVs and alternative fuel vehicles are a really important point in terms of the budget that we have and where we need to get to, either in terms of the CA's target and vision, but equally the government's target, it means we need to stay within those budgets. And that means that in many cases, EVs are not the only solution and behaviour change is required. I'll quickly skip over the next couple of slides. Essentially, the Green Paper talks about the action that we need to take in the short term, so within the next 10, 9, 8 years. And that's thinking about sort of those quick fixes. So thinking about how we might serve some of our personal mobility needs through other modes that may not be quite as energy intensive as a private car. And that's kind of some of the conversations that we're having around, what could be the alternative. And then continuing to sort of supplement and improve other forms of travel, such as walking and cycling, and encouraging a shift to different forms of providing mobility. So shared mobility, mobility as a service. Obviously, we've seen e-scooters that was on the agenda earlier. So all these sorts of things need to become more mainstream in how we deal with mobility alongside those other improvements. The next slide then talks about sort of what we need to do in the longer term. Obviously, land use is not going to be changed significantly overnight, and certainly not to the extent that we might be talking about that we need that change to happen within the next 10 years, but we need to start planning for it and thinking about it sooner rather than later, so that our land use plans can start to make sure they are sort of delivering those changes as we need to see fit going forward. Things like our mass transit network, absolutely, we still need to develop and improve public transport. But again, the delivery of some of these things isn't going to be done at pace and at scale, so they fall into the longer term. And there's still issues around sort of that embedded carbon, that even building and improving some of our public transport networks still comes with a carbon cost, and that's all sort of thing that's got to be factored into our thinking as we go forward. And we also know that not everything is the same, and whilst there are cities around the world that have different solutions, equally transport is different within an urban area like the West Midlands. We have big urban centres, we have local centres, neighbourhoods, and we have rural areas, and they all have slightly different issues. Even though the challenges might be very similar, the response to those needs to be tailored and developed for those locales and knitted together, so that we kind of have a strategy that works across the region and takes account of those differences. So I think we'll just skip over these. We've touched on a few of these, but essentially our current strategy is not going to cut it. And I'll just quickly go through, just skip over these, and we'll cut straight to the last bit. Go again, and again. So where we are at the moment, and just talk about those kind of issues of areas. We're developing a new framework for the LTP, which will look at each area and give each part of the West Midlands its own area strategy, essentially, that will be sort of led by the principles and the policy framework in the LTP, but also it will work with documents such as the Birmingham Transport Plan and other area local policy documents that each individual local authority wants to have as well. And that's quite important to have those area strategies, because some of the policies and measures need to be set out in more detail for each of those areas. And being part of the LTP framework will give them more weight through a statutory process, because the LTP is a statutory document. Engagement has been really important in this as we've gone through the process, and we've tried to use a range of channels. Obviously, we've been slightly limited by the pandemic, and that we've not been able to go out and do as much face-to-face engagement as we may have done. But we're trying to do some last-minute stuff with businesses in particular to try and have those face-to-face discussions on some of these difficult issues. But the most important thing is we've done some deliberative engagement, which I think has really helped us get into the nub of some of the big issues that we're dealing with here. And finally, just really quickly then, our programme currently looks at this, but it's of course subject to change. We're just coming towards the end of the engagement of the Green Paper, and next Friday we're having what we termed a Transport Summit. It's a discussion with West Midlands leaders to sort of play through some of the key issues and themes that we're sort of developing as we're going through the LTP around what works, what doesn't, what's going to move the dial if we're really serious about decarbonisation, and also what people are saying to us. Actually, some of the things that might be difficult, really that unpopular with people, are they kind of likely to embrace these things, and who might be willing to embrace those things easier than better than other people. We're working through on the strategy for the rest of the year, and there'll be ongoing engagement with members and leaders around what's going to be in that strategy. And we're aiming to have that statutory consultation started early next year. So sorry, that was a bit longer. You've all got the pack. We'll try and answer some questions. I'm just flagging I do need to be away at 4 o'clock, I'm afraid. Thank you.
Thanks very much, both of you. That was, yes, very, very good presentation. Sorry I had to hurry you at the end, just because it's quite a, well, it's sort of conceptually a big set of really big issues, isn't it? And I think that I've heard the presentation before and talked to you about it, and it's really asking some fundamental questions about how much mobility we need or expect in future. Because I think all of us as local councillors are encountering the problem that simply we are running out of space for cars on residential streets, especially like terrace streets like the one that I live on. And I suppose the points that you were both making at the end about that how open to and confident are politicians in the region about taking forward these messages about the lifestyle changes that are going to be necessary really to meet the challenges of the carbon reduction. Because I think in effect, I think a lot of the plans that we've got they're going in the right direction, but they're not going to be adequate for the level of change that we need, and that's really a political challenge for all of us. Okay, I'm going to open it up for any comments or questions from colleague councillors. Zeka, Councillor Chowdhury, go ahead.
Right, thank you for your presentation. It was a long and comprehensive presentation. Right, I got a couple of questions. Inner cities, the properties wasn't built to accommodate the cars, in 60s, 50s, 40s, and now every family has 2-3 cars. The families are grown up, and the properties are just terrace properties. They get nowhere to park. So what plans are we putting in place to accommodate those inner city areas?
Okay, so I think that's a really good question. Obviously, some of that behaviour and that car ownership patterns have appeared and developed for a range of reasons. I think going forward, one of the things that we're starting to suggest is that perhaps that whole level of car ownership and why people have cars, we need to look differently at some of the options that might be available to them. So it's not necessarily about accommodating the cars, it's about looking at new solutions to mobility. And that, I appreciate, does sort of raise some sort of difficult considerations, because I'm sure that people don't want to give up their cars. They see the value of them, and I think part of this conversation is trying to strip away some of that and go, well, actually, what could you do differently? Because we know that there are lots of journeys that could be made without a car, and there is potential to think differently about our relationship with personal mobility. And that's one of the things we're sort of saying is, there are other ways to facilitate some of the mobility that we currently have. So in some of those, areas where at the moment we've got demand for parking that outstrips the supply of on-street space, one of the ways to solve some of those problems is to help people, encourage people to consider and use different mobility solutions. Some of that will be through improving public transport. Some of that will be looking at changes to, how we might facilitate some of our personal mobility journeys. That could be walking and cycling for some of them instead of using a car. It could be using micro-mobility for other journeys. It could also be, and I alluded to this, sort of different ways of having access to a car. So at the moment, you might have a family that has 3-4 cars in it. And actually, if you were to boil that down and look at how much some of those vehicles are used, there could be other ways of people being able to access cars by having car clubs or other things that just make it easier so that people can use the right tool for the right choice. And I know that sort of sounds somewhat sort of alien and controversial language, but it is something that if we're serious about not just carbon but the other motives, we do need to think about, because ultimately otherwise we continue to predict and provide, we have car ownership increasing, and then we've still got to find places to park those cars. And in those sort of areas, I suppose no one's really going to sort of volunteer to have their property demolished so that their neighbours can park their cars on it. And that's a perennial problem that, you know, I've seen in the last 20 years working in local government. Some of these have very difficult solutions, and this is the kind of difficult conversation that we now need to have. And I think the key point would be to say a new LTP probably needs to have the basis that it's not business as usual, and we have to look at these problems in a different light.
Sorry, just can I just comment quickly?
Just very quickly.
Just very quickly. So, what are your predictions for next 10 years? How much reduction you are expecting in cars?
Well, at the moment, I think it's likely that car use will continue to increase, car ownership will continue to increase, traffic levels and congestion will continue to increase. We're seeing, particularly at the back of the pandemic, that sort of return to car use is far greater than public transport. So for us at the moment, if we're talking about making good progress on the issues we've raised in those motives for change, we're going in the wrong direction already as we come out of the pandemic. Where things will get to, the future's uncertain. I think that's the only thing that is certain. And we really need to think about the sort of future we want. Do we want, you know, streets lined with more and more cars and more traffic? Because even if we electrify everything or change to alternative fuels, if we still meet and satisfy our mobility needs in the way we're doing it within the urban area, we're still going to have the problems that we already have, because we have finite space, finite capacity. We need to think about doing those things differently. That, of course, means change, and change comes with challenge, and some people are afraid of change, of course. And through this process, we need to find ways and means of making some of that change as easy and as attractive as possible. But that doesn't mean that it's always going to be, you know, carrot and not stick, I think. And that's part of the discussion that we need to have.
Thanks very much, David, because I know that you're generally a positive person, so you don't want to be a prophet of doom. But I feel that, you know, that really, if we carry on with the same level or increasing level of car ownership, then really we won't meet any of these targets for reducing net carbon emissions. And I suppose that's why you were touched on it at the end of your comments, and I was asking about it as well. It's really about how we're communicating to people, you know, the level of, you know, lifestyle changes that, you know, that are going to be required if we don't want to end up in a situation where we've got irreversible climate change and the changes in weather patterns which are starting to affect us all. We're getting to 4 o'clock, so I know you've got a time constraint, which is a shame, because this is a really huge issue, and I think does come back to all of us in the dialogues that we're having, you know, particularly with local residents. I mean, for me, you know, and we've had this conversation before, that at the moment with the public, you know, the public transport offer that we've got and the lack of a fully integrated public transport network, you know, you're always going to have an inferior experience without a car in this West Midlands conurbation. But you set out, you know, ways in this paper that, you know, we can start to, you know, to genuinely level that up, and also the government's announcement of the Sustainable Cities Fund, you know, which is a 5-year, you know, funding pot, which the CA is bidding in for now, and will be an increase in funding. I mean, that's going to give access to, you know, some of the infrastructure funding that's needed to start making changes. But I think, you know, as scrutiny councillors, we need to be looking at, you know, what's the balance of spend going forward, and in investment terms, is public transport and active travel being prioritised as against road travel? Because if you look at, you know, what you were saying about, you know, the size and weight of cars, if they continue to get larger, then you've got, you know, the total inefficiency of cars, which, you know, for 80% of the time their park's not being used anyway, and often they're just driving around in one human in a vehicle that can weigh, you know, 1,800 or 2,000 kilograms, you know, of metal, you know, to move around. As you say, it's not efficient compared to a mass transit system of any kind. But there's no doubt, you know, that the dialogue, you know, with residents in the city is going to be a challenging one, and we're all aware of, you know, what it's like with electoral cycles and the extent to which, you know, people are prepared to hold the line as elections come near. But The final thing that I just wanted to ask about, so you'll be reporting the green paper and engagement outcomes to the board in next week, I think you said. But then what happens after that?
So essentially, we talk to the leaders next week, and some of the feedback from the green paper will be sort of played through to them. What we're then doing is going to that strategy development stage. We'll have a sense of where leaders want to go, although we don't expect to have, definitive, it's these things out of next week's discussion. We think there'll be an iterative process of going, okay, so you said you want to go in this direction. Therefore, it means, we need to start delivering these sorts of things at these sorts of scale, at this sort of pace. Are you comfortable with that? And I think it will be a kind of ongoing discussion. I think there's probably opportunities that we can come back to scrutiny as well to update, how those discussions are going as we go through the process too.
The final thing that I committed to doing, because I got an email from the West Midlands Climate Action Network, was that they are campaigning on the issue of free public transport as an incentive for people to start making these changes into the way that they move around. And obviously, I think for a number of us, for me, for example, I would support this in principle, and I know that it's being done in a number of European cities as a way of incentivizing people to leave their cars at home. But do you think that it's possible? Is it something that would ever be possible within our current funding systems for public transport?
I don't think it's possible with our current funding systems. I mean, just to give you an idea, that I think we did some work to look at the sort of cost of providing a completely free offer to sort of 5 to 25-year-olds. I think the calculations came out that costs something around £105 million per annum just to run that. So if you then scale that up to everyone, that's potentially a massive amount of money that currently we wouldn't have the budget for. We'd have to think of other ways of potentially driving that income or developing that income, which could, of course, a decision could be that could be done through raising charges on the motorist, for example. Those are things that could be explored, but there is no immediate kind of budget that would say, yes, we can do that. I think it's also just worth reflecting that it's not necessarily the best way that we could spend certain money. While subsidies to allow certain groups better access to travel, I think would be absolutely the right thing to do, and we obviously do it through our supported travel policies now. I think the reality is that even if you had free travel across the piece, the amount that it would move the dial in terms of shift in terms of travel behaviours would not be as significant as many people consider. I think we sort of touched it in the presentation. Public transport's great on certain fixed routes on key corridors, but a lot of the travel that we see now, thinking back to that graph where the line goes off, we're doing a lot of travel that currently public transport could never actually replicate. And so it's not just simply about free public transport, it's about dealing with those other trips and thinking about those differently that are probably more important. And so the money that we might want to spend on subsidising free public transport has had various impacts in different areas, but then there are localized issues that then make it more favorable in some European cities than others, for example. So that's, I think, where we are. The full stop would be, it's very expensive. We would need to think about how we could fund it and fund it sustainably going forward.
Thanks for the yes. I'd agree to raise that, so I just wanted to have to get your view on that. I mean, I suppose for me, as someone who's lived in Birmingham since 1999, without a car because I cannot drive, I would say actually having some public transport across all parts of the city would be a much more important place to start. Because for me, what's qualitatively different living in the West Midlands conurbation to bits of London or some European cities that I know is just the coverage and the frequency of the public transport and the ability to move around in the evenings and a weekend and across suburbs. So I think we're all aware of what the challenges are.
I see Councillor Huxley's got his hand up. I do need to be a quick.
Councillor Huxley, do a quick comment, but if you need to go, David, do.
This is more addressed to Councillor Clements, David, rather than you. And the fact is that we do already have free public transport for a group through the English National Concessionary Travel Scheme. And my understanding is that even though it's free through the OAP bus pass to call it for one, but obviously in the West Midlands, we also say you can use the train for free off peak, you can use the metro for free, etc. That hasn't actually increased travel journeys within that age group. So we know it is not necessarily an economic thing by the various studies looking at that particular group where we do subsidise free public transport travel.
No, I think you're right, and also I think at the moment we have the challenge to actually keep the other discretionary fare, the concessionary fare schemes going. So, I mean, I'm interested in other things like patterns that have happened in cities like Vienna, where they've actually, they're not, it's not free, but it's very cheap. So there is a travel pass for €365 for the whole integrated network of Greater Vienna. So effectively travel for €1 a day. And in that city, I mean, obviously they're in a different position because they've got a much more extensive network. It's much more frequent, but they are showing big changes in the number of journeys that are being done by public transport. And 40% of households and rising no longer have a car. So I think there's some big issues to think about here. Okay, I'm going to release David and Alex from the here. And thank you very much for that presentation. And sorry we had to hurry you a bit, but I think it's a really excellent piece of work, and it's posing some really big and meaty and challenging questions for local leaders. And I hope they're going to they and all of us are going to rise to the challenge. Thanks very much.
Thank you. See you.
Yeah, thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, sorry, colleagues, we're overrunning a bit. Just to go back to the agenda, if I can find it again. Okay, on the work programme, that's been circulated. It seems circulated with the papers. Are there any questions that anyone wants to or issues that anyone wants to raise about the work programme at the moment?
None from me.
Not from you.
Not from me.
Okay, yeah, because I could see a hand that was a
not at the moment. We might have something later on, but not at the moment.
Now, as ever, and if there's anything that occurs to you after the meeting, do drop me and Basima a line. So on a session in October is going to be about confidence in using public transport, which I think sort of follows on nicely from that discussion about the future of moving around in the region and what public transport is actually available for people to use.
One interesting issue about the future of public transport and the confidence of using public transport is that at our last meeting in July, the Cabinet member assured the committee that the changes to the number 11 outer circle were only temporary and would be restored in the autumn, as is reflected in our minutes. And it'd be very interesting to pick that one up in October, Chair.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, when we've got the bus, when we've got National Express there, and who is John Hayes coming, or I can't remember who's actually, is Pete Bond coming? Basima?
That's going to be initially a representation from Transport for West Midlands, but I think they're going to decide who's going.
I couldn't hear some of that, but
yeah, sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
So we will have representation from Transport for West Midlands, and it's just to be decided which officers come along. Obviously, they don't want to come too many men.
Yeah, but we'll be sure to.
Yeah, we will have a couple of.
So we can follow that up when we've got them in front of us. I think that's a good question to ask, because we've got our sort of iconic single bus route that's now become a game of two halves, as it were. Okay, if there's any, as I say, if there's any other questions about the work programme, then let me know. I mean, I'm hoping that we are going to be able to spend some time in the rest of this year looking at the climate change action plan, as I said, at full council, because that's very much on my mind. Have we had any requests for call-ins or any council call for actions or petitions? I'm certainly not aware of any. And are there any other urgent business items or any matters that anyone wants to raise? The only thing that I'd just say is that we should have had today a tracking report on the plastics inquiry, and we had to pull that item because it hadn't been possible for officers to pull the report together. So I am a bit concerned about the rate of progress or slow progress against the recommendations from that plastics inquiry, which wasn't a very significant piece of work by this committee. So we are following that up, and we'll hope we'll have a report in November. So I think that brings our business to an end. Can you give me authority to act between the meetings with the relevant chief officer if necessary?
Agreed.
Agreed.
Thank you very much, and thanks for bearing with us. Sorry it's overrun slightly today, and have a good rest of the day. Enjoy the rest of the sunny afternoon. Thanks everybody.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye. Bye.